Picture this, Madrid, 1665. The heart of an empire that, by all accounts, still had the sun on its payroll. You're a foreign ambassador, maybe French, maybe Venetian, dressed in your finest silks, walking the hallowed halls of the Alcazar Palace. Gold leaf gleams, tapestries tell tales of victory and dominion. Every footstep echoes with the weight of history, power, and absolute monarchy. You're here to meet the King of Spain, the man who rules territories from the silver mines of Potosi to the spice islands of the Philippines. You expect majesty, a figure carved from granite and command. You expect the living embodiment of Habsburg might. And then you meet Charles II, and the world tilts on its axis. He isn't carved granite, he's broken porcelain. His mouth hangs open, a perpetual gaping maw that defies closing, like a door ripped from its hinges by a storm. When he tries to speak, it's not the resonant voice of a sovereign, but a wet, guttural struggle, gurgles, slurs, sounds that make you flinch. His body isn't regal. It's a roadmap of deformities, twisted in ways that shouldn't be possible, the stuff of whispers and nightmares. His own people, in hushed tones behind cupped hands, call him El Hechizado, the bewitched one, cursed, touched by dark magic. But here's the real horror, the chilling truth hidden beneath the gilded surface of the Spanish court. Charles II wasn't cursed by demons or sorcery. He was cursed by his own blood, cursed by the very family that built the sprawling, sun-drenched empire. This isn't a ghost story, it's a genetic horror show, a saga of how Europe's most powerful dynasty, the mighty Habsburgs, committed slow, deliberate suicide, creating a human catastrophe on the throne who would, in his very existence, set the stage for one of history's most brutal wars. Before we dive into the shadows of this forgotten history, let's be clear. This story isn't for the faint of heart. It's about survival, suffering, and the terrifying consequences of human arrogance writ large across a continent. To grasp the full gut-wrenching tragedy that was Charles II, you first have to understand the twisted, terrifying mindset of the Habsburg family. For over 200 years, they'd been playing God with their own biology. They'd conquered half the known world, amassed unimaginable wealth and power. Their empire was vast, stretching from the sun-baked plains of Spain to the misty mountains of Austria, from the bustling ports of the Netherlands to the distant islands of the Philippines. The sun quite literally never set on Habsburg lands. But power, for them, came with a crippling paranoia. They developed an obsession, a sickness really, about keeping their bloodline pure. Now, for most nobles, that meant marrying within the aristocracy. For the Habsburgs, that meant marrying themselves, uncles marrying nieces, first cousins marrying first cousins. If the family tree started looking a little too sparse, a little too normal, they just grafted new branches onto existing ones. It's a nightmare scenario, and it produced a nightmare result. Let's talk numbers, because the numbers tell a brutal story. Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. Now, unless you're a geneticist, that number might not mean much. So let's put it this way. That's higher than what you'd get if you were the child of a brother and a sister. But Charles wasn't the result of one single, horrific instance of incest. No, Charles was the grand finale, the final disastrous product of 11 consecutive generations of cousin marriages. 11 generations of the gene pool getting smaller and smaller, swirling in on itself. Imagine a family tree. Yours probably has 16 different great-grandparents. Charles II? He only had 6. His family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a tangled, suffocating web where the same names, the same faces, appeared over and over again, occupying multiple spots simultaneously. Anna of Austria, his mother, was somehow also his aunt, his grandmother, and his great-grandmother. Philip II, his great-great-grandfather, was also his grandfather and his great-grandfather. It's mind-bending, isn't it? Modern geneticists looking at the Habsburg pedigree charts have calculated that Charles had less genetic diversity than a child born to full siblings. This wasn't an accident. This was the culmination of centuries of marriage practices that had systematically, ruthlessly eliminated every last drop of fresh blood from the royal line. And here's the truly chilling part. The Habsburgs knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't ignorance. They had warnings. Court records from the 1500s show royal advisors, physicians, even family members pleading with the rulers, highlighting the dangers of such close intermarriage. Spanish doctors meticulously documented the horrifying results: soaring rates of stillbirths, infant mortality that wiped out half the royal nursery, and physical deformities that were becoming increasingly grotesque with each generation. But the family's response, always the same: double down, marry closer. They noticed their children were being born weaker, more deformed, with that increasingly pronounced Habsburg jaw, the jutting lower jaw, the hallmark of their inbreeding. They saw children who couldn't walk until they were 8, fertility problems that plagued generation after generation, sudden, unexplained deaths in infancy and childhood. Instead of changing course, instead of introducing new blood to save their future, the Habsburgs chose a different path. They were so paralyzed by the fear of sharing power, of letting an outsider contaminate their pure blood, that they literally chose to sacrifice their own children on the altar of their twisted ideology. When Philip IV, Charles's father, saw the infant who would inherit his throne, the undeniably, horrifyingly deformed child, his first instinct wasn't compassion or medical help. It was damage control. He ordered every single portrait of the child destroyed. He forbade anyone from speaking of the prince's condition outside the palace walls under pain of death. The truth was too humiliating for Europe's most powerful family. This obsessive secrecy created a horrifying feedback loop. Each new generation of Habsburg rulers was more genetically damaged than the last, a ticking bomb. But the family's pathological obsession with maintaining their image, their illusion of divine perfection, meant that acknowledging the problem was unthinkable, let alone trying to fix it. So, when Charles II was finally born on November 6, 1661, there was no joyous ringing of bells across Madrid, no shouts of celebration, only silence. A shocked, heavy, horrified silence fell over the birthing chamber. The midwives, hardened women who had seen it all, froze. A whisper, cold and fast as a winter draft, snaked through the palace. The child was hideously deformed. So twisted, so broken, many believed he had been stillborn. His head was enormous, a monstrous weight on a tiny, frail body. His eyes were so wide apart he looked almost alien. And his mouth was already fixed in that terrible, permanent gape that would define and torment his entire short life. But here's the most terrifying part, the part that chills you to the bone. No one dared speak the truth, not one soul. The midwives were dragged aside, threatened with death if they ever spoke of what they had witnessed. Doctors were forced, under duress, to sign official documents swearing that the newborn prince was perfectly healthy, a picture of royal vigor. The immense propaganda machine of the Spanish crown roared to life, determined to bury the truth at all costs. But you can't hide reality forever, especially when reality is born with a crown waiting for him. The stage was set. The final act of the Habsburg tragedy had begun.
Charles II's early years weren't childhood. They were a living, breathing nightmare, conducted behind locked palace doors, shrouded in desperate secrecy. He couldn't lift his own head until he was 6 years old. 6! Most babies manage that within weeks. He couldn't walk until he was 8. Think about that. 8 years old, and he still couldn't support his own weight. Couldn't take a single independent step. Basic communication was a monumental struggle. He couldn't speak intelligibly until he was 10. Every single developmental milestone that normal children breeze past felt like an insurmountable mountain range for Charles. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this tragedy was the dawning, terrifying realization that Charles himself seemed aware of his condition, aware that he was different, broken. Court physicians, the few allowed near him, recorded chilling observations. The child would often cry for hours on end, without any apparent physical cause, as if you were trapped in constant, unbearable pain, a suffering that had no name. He couldn't sleep properly because of that terrible gaping jaw deformity. His enormous tongue had a tendency to slip backwards, threatening to choke him, blocking his airway night after night. The wet nurses, the women tasked with feeding and caring for the infant king, were terrified. One after another they quit, fled, or were dismissed. Some were caught making the sign of the cross, a desperate warding off of evil as they approached his cradle. Others whispered prayers under their breath, their eyes wide with fear, as if they were in the presence of something unnatural, something tainted. Palace records from this period, dry, bureaucratic entries, paint a horrifying picture when you read between the lines. A royal household living in constant, low-grade terror. Servants drawing lots to decide who had the grim duty of entering the prince's chambers. A literal gamble with their peace of mind. Guards stationed near his rooms reported hearing strange sounds at night. Not quite the cries of a human child, but something else. Something disturbing, echoing down the silent corridors. When Charles turned 5, the moment of truth arrived for the court artists. An official portrait was commissioned. The painter selected was Juan Carreño de Miranda, a master of his craft, a man accustomed to capturing the majesty of the royal family. He arrived at the Alcázar expecting to paint a slightly sickly, maybe plain, but ultimately normal royal child. What he saw instead hit him like a physical blow. It shocked him so profoundly that he initially refused the commission. He simply couldn't bring himself to capture the reality of the boy. In private letters to his wife, Miranda poured out his horror and confusion. He described the prince as more beast than boy, a creature that seemed barely human. He confessed that he had nightmares for weeks after their initial meeting, the image of the child seared into his mind. When he finally, reluctantly, completed the portrait, he used every trick in the book, every artistic technique known at the time to soften the deformities, to make Charles appear as normal, as presentable as possible. He draped him in luxurious fabrics, posed him carefully, adjusted angles and lighting. Yet even these desperate, flattering attempts couldn't completely hide the devastating truth of what generations of Habsburg purity had created. There was still the undeniable shape of the head, the odd set of the eyes. And the most disturbing aspect, the thing that Miranda couldn't hide, was in the eyes themselves. The artist wrote that Charles's eyes held a peculiar intelligence, a glimmer of understanding trapped within a fundamentally broken vessel. The child seemed to grasp on some level that he was different, that people recoiled from him, were afraid. But he couldn't comprehend why. Desperate to maintain the facade to present Charles to the world as a viable heir, a future king, the court launched an elaborate, soul-crushing charade. Official court ceremonies were meticulously choreographed to hide his disabilities. When foreign ambassadors, crucial eyes watching from across Europe, came for audiences, Charles would be strategically positioned, sometimes behind specially designed furniture, heavy and ornate, that concealed his lower body in the way he struggled to stand or walk. His food was a constant, humiliating ordeal. It had to be pre-cut into tiny pieces, mixed into a pastel-like consistency, or pureed entirely, so he could eat without the public spectacle of drooling, choking, and inability to chew. But children, bless their terrifying honesty, have a way of puncturing the most carefully constructed illusions. When Charles was 7, an Italian ambassador arrived with his young son. The court, perhaps in a moment of foolish optimism, arranged a meeting between the two boys. The Italian boy, innocent and unfiltered, took one look at Charles and recoiled as if struck. He began screaming, loud, piercing screams, shouting, "Monster! Monster!" in Italian, pointing at the Spanish prince. The incident was a disaster. It caused a minor diplomatic crisis. More importantly, it shattered any lingering illusions, any desperate hope that Charles's condition could be hidden or explained away as a mere family trait.
The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a prominent chin, it was a genetic catastrophe, centuries in the making. And in Charles II, it reached its absolute horrifying peak. His lower jaw jutted out so far that even when he tried to close his mouth, there was a gap you could supposedly slide a coin through. Modern medical analysis, looking back at portraits and descriptions, suggests severe mandibular prognathism combined with macroglossia, an enlarged tongue, and possibly even acromegaly or other metabolic disorders. But 17th century observers didn't have clinical terms. They saw a king whose face seemed designed by a cruel, vengeful god as a punishment for his family's sins. Foreign diplomats, obligated to report back to their sovereigns, left detailed accounts of their shock, their revulsion upon meeting him. The Venetian ambassador wrote with stark honesty that the king's mouth hung perpetually open like a fish gasping for air. The French envoy described his speech as the sound a drowning man might make. Even Spain's allies couldn't completely conceal their horror. Every meal became a grotesque, public spectacle. Charles simply couldn't chew solid food. His teeth didn't align at all. The upper row sat entirely behind the lower row, making any kind of normal mastication impossible. The royal kitchens had to prepare all his food like baby mush, everything pureed, mashed, or blended into a liquid. But even then, eating was a messy, agonizing process. Soup would dribble from the corners of his mouth. Any tiny solid pieces would simply fall back out. Royal dinners, meant to be displays of magnificent power and refined culture, devolved into horrifying performances where servants constantly hovered, dabbing saliva from their king's chin with napkins. The psychological toll on Charles must have been devastating. He was acutely aware of how repulsive his eating habits appeared to others. Court records show he often refused to eat in public, choosing to starve himself rather than endure the profound humiliation. This led to severe malnutrition, which only further weakened his already frail body. Perhaps even worse than the eating difficulties was his speech impediment. The same extreme jaw deformity that made eating impossible turned every attempt at royal proclamation, every necessary conversation, into a torturous struggle. His words came out as wet, slurred mumbles that even his most dedicated courtiers struggled to decipher. Foreign diplomats needed interpreters, not because they didn't speak Spanish, but because they literally couldn't understand what the King of Spain was trying to say. Important matters of state, even simple commands, had to be communicated through written messages handed to him or through courtiers who tried to guess his meaning and repeat it aloud. This created a fundamental constitutional crisis. How could a king rule? How could he govern an empire if he couldn't even communicate effectively with his own government? Palace scribes worked overtime, desperately transcribing Charles's garbled speech into official documents, but even they often had to rely on context and guesswork. The most heartbreaking accounts come from Charles himself, in rare moments of agonizing clarity. In letters written in his shaky, difficult-to-control hand, he expressed his profound frustration at being trapped, imprisoned within a body that simply would not obey his will. One surviving letter, chilling in its despair, reads, "I am a prisoner in my own flesh, and God has made me king of the greatest empire on earth as some cosmic jest." The Habsburg jaw was just the most visible, the most infamous symptom. Charles II's entire body was a medical disaster, a walking testament to genetic decay. The full extent of his deformities would have sent shivers down the spine of a medieval villager. At the age of 35, he looked like a sick child who had been cruelly stretched and twisted. He barely reached 5 feet tall, but it wasn't just his height that was wrong. His proportions were fundamentally off. His head was massively oversized compared to his frail body, bobbing around on a neck that seemed barely capable of supporting the weight. His limbs were stick-thin, almost skeletal, while his torso was oddly compressed, his shoulders hunched forward. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't just his current state, but the fact that his body seemed to be actively deteriorating. While most people reach physical maturity and stabilize, Charles was constantly getting worse, weaker, more twisted. He couldn't walk until he was 8. Let that sink in. Most children take their first steps around their first birthday.
Charles spent nearly a decade unable to support his own body weight. When he finally did manage to walk, it wasn't a regal stride, but a stumbling, lurching shuffle.
With the future of the vast Spanish Empire hanging precariously on the health of its broken king, the court embarked on a frantic, often cruel, search for an heir. Charles II married twice, both times under immense political pressure, both times hoping against hope that the impossible might happen. His first wife was Marie Louise of Orleans, a princess of France, vivacious, intelligent, and full of life. She arrived in Spain expecting to marry a king, a figure of power and romance. Instead, she found herself bound to what courtiers whispered was barely a man, a pitiful, unsettling figure. The wedding night, that crucial moment meant to seal the future of the dynasty, was reportedly an epic disaster. Palace servants, whose testimonies were later recorded, spoke of Marie Louise emerging from the royal bedchamber in tears, distraught and visibly shaken. Charles, meanwhile, appeared confused, distressed, seemingly bewildered by the whole affair. The same devastating genetic mutations that had twisted his body into a catalog of deformities had also left him functionally impotent. His reproductive organs were severely underdeveloped, described by the physicians of the era as infantile. Essentially, Charles had the sexual maturity of a prepubescent boy, trapped in a failing adult body. But admitting this truth, that would have been a political apocalypse. The Spanish crown could not acknowledge that its king was biologically incapable of producing an heir. So they chose a different, crueler strategy. They blamed the woman. Instead of facing the reality of Charles's condition, the court turned Marie Louise into a scapegoat. She was officially declared barren. The pressure on her was immense, unbearable. She was subjected to humiliating, invasive medical examinations. Physicians forced her to drink disgusting herbal concoctions, endure painful procedures, and live under constant, suffocating scrutiny from a court that desperately needed her to achieve the impossible, to produce an heir with a husband who couldn't father one. The psychological toll was immense. Marie Louise, who had arrived in Spain full of youthful spirit and intelligence, became withdrawn, deeply depressed, a ghost haunting the gilded corridors. She spent her days in prayer, locked away in her apartments, begging God for a miracle that her biology and her husband's would never allow. Some historians looking at the records suspect she may have been slowly poisoned by the archaic, often toxic, fertility treatments and the sheer, unremitting stress forced upon her. Her private letters to her family in France paint a picture of absolute despair. She wrote of being married to a ghost, describing Charles as more pitiful than frightening, but ultimately impossible to love. When she died mysteriously at the age of 26, the official cause was given as appendicitis, but many whispered suicide, or worse, murder, either by despair or deliberate means to make way for a queen who might succeed where she failed. When medical science and human intervention utterly failed to explain or cure Charles II's condition, the Spanish court, steeped in superstition and religious dogma, turned to the supernatural. What followed were some of the most bizarre, unsettling, and ultimately tragic religious ceremonies ever performed on a living monarch. Public exorcisms, conducted within the hallowed, magnificent walls of the royal palace itself. The church had a simple, horrifying explanation for the king's afflictions. He was possessed by demons. Father Antonio Fernandez Dundares, the court's chief exorcist, a man whose fervent belief bordered on fanaticism, declared that Charles was inhabited by multiple evil spirits. These demons, he claimed, had been placed there through witchcraft,
a malicious attack directed against the sacred person of the Spanish king and the Habsburg crown. And here's where it gets truly wild, truly horrifying. These exorcisms weren't private, hushed affairs in some hidden chapel. Oh no. These were full-scale theatrical productions, staged in the very throne room. Nobles, courtiers, and foreign dignitaries were not only permitted, but forced to attend, compelled to watch their king writhing on the floor, convulsing, while priests screamed Latin incantations over his body. Father Diaz, the lead exorcist, would begin each session by forcing Charles to drink holy water, mixed with ground-up religious relics, fragments of bone, cloth, who knows what else. The king would immediately become violently ill, retching and vomiting, likely from drinking what was essentially dirty water filled with God knows what, which the priest triumphantly interpreted as the demons violently reacting to the holy substances. Charles would shake uncontrollably, sometimes losing consciousness, while Father Diaz shouted that he could see the evil spirits being expelled from the king's tormented body. These ceremonies could last for hours. Charles, already weakened and confused, was subjected to aggressive physical manipulation as priests attempted to literally wrestle the supposed demons from his flesh. They would press heavy crucifixes against his skin until he cried out in pain, splash him violently with holy water, and force him to recite prayers in Latin, a language he could barely comprehend given his severe intellectual limitations. Foreign ambassadors, hardened men who had seen the brutality of war, wrote detailed accounts describing these exorcisms as more disturbing than any torture I have ever witnessed. But the exorcist wasn't satisfied with just tormenting the king. Father Diaz became convinced that the entire royal palace was cursed, infested with unseen evil. This led to one of the most surreal and bizarre episodes in royal history. In 1698, he ordered a systematic purification of the Alcazar, an event that resembled something between a deranged spring cleaning and supernatural warfare. Servants were ordered to gather every single item that might be contaminated by witchcraft or demonic influence. This included personal belongings of previous queens, gifts from foreign courts that were deemed suspicious, tapestries, paintings, even pieces of furniture. These objects, steeped in history and wealth, were dragged to the palace courtyard and piled high. Then massive bonfires were lit. As the flames rose, consuming centuries of royal possessions, priests circled the fires, chanting exorcism prayers. The smoke from these pyres was so thick, so acrid, that it could be seen from miles away, billowing over the Madrid skyline. Citizens in the city center gathered in the streets, staring at the smoke, wondering if the royal palace was under attack, fearing invasion or rebellion. The reality was in a way even more absurd and tragic. Their king was burning his own dynasty's history to drive away imaginary demons. The most heartbreaking aspect of this entire charade was that Charles, in his limited mental capacity and desperate physical pain, seemed to believe it was working. The priest told him the demons were being expelled, and in moments of temporary relief from his constant suffering, he would latch on to their explanation. This created a horrific cycle. Whenever his physical symptoms worsened, his jaw pain, his difficulty breathing, his general misery, he would beg for more exorcisms, convinced that only increasingly extreme religious interventions could save him. Palace records show that Charles underwent over 50 formal exorcism sessions during the last 5 years of his life. Each one left him weaker, more traumatized, and more mentally disturbed. Yet he continued to demand them, trapped by fear, convinced that without constant spiritual cleansing, the demons would fully possess his broken body and soul. The Habsburg dynasty's relentless, blinding pursuit of absolute power through genetic purity had ultimately destroyed everything they sought to protect. Their empire, vast and powerful, crumbled from within. Their bloodline, so obsessively guarded, ended with a man who was a living monument to its failure. And their final king became a cautionary tale, a stark, brutal illustration of the dangers of defying natural law, of believing that human will, political maneuvering, or even divine right can overcome fundamental biological reality. The Habsburgs thought they could concentrate power indefinitely by keeping it locked within their family. They believed their bloodline was so superior, so divinely blessed, that mixing it with outsiders would only dilute and weaken it. They were catastrophically, fatally wrong. And Charles II paid the ultimate price for their hubris.
As the years passed and Charles II's health continued its slow, agonizing decline, the question of the succession became a feverish obsession at the Spanish court and across every royal house in Europe. The ghost on the throne had no heir, and his death would trigger a power vacuum of unimaginable scale. The great powers, France and Austria primarily, were already circling, their diplomats and spies maneuvering for position, forging secret treaties, preparing for the inevitable conflict. Charles, trapped in his failing body and clouded mind, was less a ruler and more a symbol, a living time bomb counting down to continental war. He married a second time, a desperate, politically motivated union with Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. The court hoped, against all evidence, that a new wife might miraculously succeed where Marie-Louise had failed. Maria Anna was chosen for her robust health and her family's notorious fertility. The pressure on her was immediate and relentless, mirroring the torment inflicted on her predecessor. But biology remained stubbornly indifferent to political necessity. Charles was still incapable of fathering children. Maria Anna, like Marie-Louise before her, faced humiliation, suspicion, and the despair of a queen whose sole purpose was to produce an heir with a king who physically could not. She quickly realized the terrifying reality of her situation and became increasingly manipulative and desperate, aligning herself with political factions who promised her influence in the inevitable succession crisis. The Spanish court, instead of a hopeful nursery, became a viper's nest of intrigue, with Maria Anna and various factions battling for control over the fading monarch's will and legacy. Meanwhile, Charles drifted through his final years, increasingly isolated, trapped between the earthly realm and some unknown state of suffering. The exorcisms continued, their frequency increasing as he grew weaker and more susceptible to Father Diaz's influence. The palace, still recovering from the bizarre purification fires, felt less like the center of a global empire and more like a haunted house, filled with whispers, fear, and the acrid smell of burned possessions. Charles spent hours staring into space, his jaw slack, his eyes distant. He would sometimes speak to unseen figures or whisper prayers for deliverance from his physical pain, which he remained convinced was the work of demons. His attendants, jaded by years of serving the bewitched one, moved with a mixture of pity, fear, and resignation. They knew the end was coming. The question wasn't if, but when, and what horrors it would unleash upon Spain and Europe. The court factions, sensing the approaching climax, became bolder, more desperate. The French faction, pushing for a Bourbon successor, Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, who also had a claim through his Spanish mother, clashed openly with the Austrian faction, who supported an Austrian Habsburg candidate, Charles, Archduke of Austria, a distant cousin. Poor Charles II, the puppet king, was pulled this and that, manipulated by his wife, his ministers, his confessors, and the relentless pressure of foreign powers, all trying to force him to sign a will naming their preferred candidate. In his final months, Charles was a shadow of a shadow, frail, emaciated, barely clinging to life. He was constantly in pain, plagued by fevers, digestive issues, and respiratory problems, exacerbated by his jaw deformity. The odor around him became more pronounced, a constant sickly presence in his chambers. He was reportedly covered in sores, his skin translucent. He could barely hold a quill to sign the documents thrust before him. He shuffled through the palace like a wraith, the last decaying symbol of a dying dynasty. On November 1st, 1700, just shy of his 39th birthday, Charles II of Spain finally succumbed. The ghost on the throne was no more. The news ripped through Europe like a thunderclap. Messengers galloped across the continent, carrying the long-awaited tidings. The empire was headless. The question of who would inherit the vast Spanish territories, the most powerful collection of land and resources in the world, was now no longer a matter of court intrigue, but of cold, hard military might. Charles's will, dictated under duress and intense pressure in his final days, ultimately named Philip of Anjou, the French candidate, as his successor. He hoped, perhaps naively, that this would keep the empire intact and prevent war. He was wrong. The idea of a Bourbon king ruling Spain, effectively uniting the power of France and Spain, was unacceptable to Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic. It shattered the balance of power. Less than a year later, Europe exploded. The War of the Spanish Succession began, a brutal, continent-spanning conflict that lasted for over a decade, killing hundreds of thousands, reshaping borders, and draining the treasuries of every major European power. All because one man, the culmination of centuries of inbreeding, couldn't produce an heir. The autopsy performed on Charles II was, in its own macabre way, a final damning indictment of the Habsburg project. The physicians were horrified by what they found. His body was a roadmap of genetic decay. His heart was described as tiny, like a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotten. He only had one testicle, and it was black and shrunken. His blood, they wrote, was corrupted, his brain soft and filled with fluid. It was the physical embodiment of biological collapse. Today, when we see Charles II's portraits, those valiant attempts by artists to hide the truth, hanging in museums, we're looking at more than just a historical figure. We're seeing the physical manifestation of human arrogance, the biological consequence of prioritizing power over health, the genetic result of defying natural selection. His twisted features, his perpetual grimace, his vacant stare, they serve as a permanent, horrifying reminder that no amount of political power, no amount of gold, no amount of human pride can overcome fundamental biological reality. The Habsburgs learned this lesson too late. They clung to their obsession with pure blood, sacrificing their own children generation after generation, convinced they were building an eternal dynasty. Instead, they built a genetic time bomb that exploded in the body of Charles II. He paid the price with his life, his dignity, and ultimately, with the survival of his dynasty's direct line and the unity of his empire. The most powerful ruling family in Europe fell, their legacy ending not with a bang, but with the pathetic whimper of a king who couldn't close his mouth. Because in the end, nature always has the last word. And for the last Habsburg king of Spain, that word was written in his deformed flesh, a brutal, damning response to centuries of genetic manipulation. He was evolution's final verdict, a king born of the ultimate biological impurity who perfectly embodied the utter failure of his dynasty's misguided quest for absolute purity and power.